Good evening, welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Lee Hall. On the show tonight, Western leaders again voiced support for Israel's self-defense and call for adherence to international law. But challenges arise as Hamas terrorists hinder international aid efforts. Also tonight, pro-Palestinian protesters in London chanted jihad and racial abuse on the weekend. The Met Police chief said the laws around hate crime and terrorism may need to be redrawn. Aid was finally delivered to Gaza, but is it enough? And a race in Belgium with a Halloween twist as competitors take to the river in hollowed out pumpkins. The British government confirms its assessment of who fired the missile that struck the hospital in Gaza last week. Intelligence experts say the explosion was likely caused from a misfired missile aiming at Israel, launched from inside Gaza.
When things are so delicate, we all have a responsibility to take additional care in the language we use and to operate on the basis of facts alone. The reaction to the horrific explosion at the Al Ahli Arab Hospital was a case in point. As I indicated last week, we have taken care to look at all the evidence currently available. Mr. Speaker, I can now share our assessment with the House. On the basis of the deep knowledge and analysis of our intelligence and weapons experts, the British government judges that the explosion was likely caused by a missile, or part of one, that was launched from within Gaza towards Israel.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak also vowed to keep up diplomatic pressure to bring what he called a constant stream of aid to Gaza: water, food, medicine and fuel. He announced an additional £20 million on top of £10 million already committed for aid in the region. Western leaders, including the UK, have increased pressure on Israel to protect civilians in Gaza, but Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields, making it very difficult for Israel to help or protect Palestinians. NTD's France correspondent David Vivez has this story for us.
Leaders of the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Britain on Sunday underscored their support for Israel and its right to defend itself, but also urged it to adhere to international humanitarian law and protect civilians. They pledged to work together closely to support their citizens in the region, and especially those wishing to leave Gaza. Biden and Netanyahu discussed the arrival of the first aid convoys to Gaza and affirmed that there will now be continued flow of this critical assistance. But governments helping Palestinians on the ground have met with interference by Hamas. International human rights lawyer David Matas, who has practiced refugee, immigration and human rights law since 1979, says the option for Western countries to assist Palestinians doesn't exist.
Canada offered resettlement to Palestinian refugees, and the Canadians that were threatened, the refugees, the politicians were burned in the streets. They were threatened with death simply because they offered a refugee solution.
The 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza have been denied refuge in neighboring Egypt. One reason for that is the risk of terrorist group Hamas launching attacks from Egypt's Sinai Peninsula on Israel, for which Israel would be entitled to defend itself and fire back, endangering the two countries' 40-year-old peace treaty. Another issue is that Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields, hindering attempts to help civilians either in Gaza or by offering them refuge.
Hamas keeps the Palestinians captive in order to generate invective against Israel for the victimization they themselves cause. And the problem with, Israel says Hamas is in the north, go to the south. So then the Palestinians go to the south and Hamas goes with them. That they'll just come in with the Palestinians, disguise themselves, use the Palestinians as human shields. And the only solution, only real solution, is eradicate Hamas completely, to the person.
Matas says the UN move to create an inquiry to monitor war crimes from both sides is unjustified. Armed conflict is governed by a set of internationally recognized laws and resolutions, including the UN Charter. Some experts say Hamas has committed war crimes by the attack on Israel that killed 1,400 Israelis and by taking hostages. But the laws also define intentional attacks on civilians or civilian settlements as a war crime, meaning Israel's response could be deemed a war crime. One of the critics holding this view is the Geneva-based International Committee of the Red Cross. Israel would likely argue it's not intentionally striking civilian infrastructure, but targeting Hamas bases, which Hamas placed there, among civilians. Matas says the UN is showing bias by launching the inquiry.
The problem isn't the United Nations writ large, because the United Nations is a wide variety of institutions and personnel. The problem is this particular inquiry. It's got a poor mandate, it's got a poor personnel. I mean, the people in charge of it have a history of one-sided blinkered condemnations of Israel. They have joined the delegitimization and demonization campaign, and it's just not a credible inquiry.
David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
Thousands of people attended a rally in London yesterday to show their solidarity with Israel and demand the release of hostages taken by Hamas. Demonstrators said such atrocities should never happen again and called on Western leaders to do more.
Bring them home! Bring them home! About 20,000 people attended a solidarity rally in central London on Sunday, calling for the safe return of hostages taken by Hamas. One woman described how she was listening over the phone as her mother was taken hostage in a settlement.
I didn't know that the safe room cannot be locked. She told me her house wasn't locked, and then I heard male voices speaking to her in English in an Arabic accent, and I realized Hamas got to her.
She then called her brother, who lives only 10 meters away from her mother, but she heard the same voices in the background. It was too late. Her brother had been taken hostage too.
A few minutes later, the Hamas sent me 2 pictures of my mom and my brother sitting in my mom's living room. And the 3rd picture they uploaded to my mom's Facebook story with a Hamas gunman in the background, and that was the last I heard of them.
She said another of her brothers had been killed by Hamas.
These atrocities should never be forgotten. The hostages should be brought home now.
In his address to the rally, Community Secretary Michael Gove condemned the evil and barbarism of Hamas and echoed calls for the hostages to be released.
And what did we see a fortnight ago? The biggest, most horrific slaughter of Jewish people since the Holocaust, carried out by terrorists, an act of evil, unparalleled evil and barbarism. We must stand together against it. We must stand for life. We must bring the hostages home.
A Holocaust survivor's grandson says he believes the leaders in the West will do their best to bring hostages back.
But at the end of the day, they have to deal with Hamas. It can never, ever, ever happen again. My family were in the Holocaust and my grandmother died in Auschwitz. We said never again. It's kind of never, we can never let it happen again.
Many demonstrators wept as the names of hostages were read out to the crowd.
9-month-old Shiri Bibas.
Videos taken over the weekend show pro-Palestinian protesters chanting jihad and shouting racial abuse. In response, the Metropolitan Police Chief said the laws around hate crime and terrorism may need to be changed. But Downing Street says the police already have extensive powers. NTD's Malcolm Hudson has more for us.
Police estimate that around 100,000 people attended a pro-Palestinian protest in London on Saturday. Many were demanding a ceasefire to the war in Gaza. But concerns were raised after a member of a separate but parallel rally was filmed shouting and calling for jihad.
Jihad! 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 Jihad!
This rally was organised by the Hizb ut-Tahrir Islamic fundamentalist group. Officers said no offences were identified in that specific clip. The Metropolitan Police says that jihad has a number of meanings. The word can mean struggle or effort, but it has also been taken to refer to holy war. Officers spoke to the man to discourage any repeats of similar chanting. Met Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley said the law needs to be stronger to deal with extremism.
And the law that we've designed around hate crime and terrorism over recent decades hasn't taken full account of the ability of extremist groups to steer around those laws and propagate some pretty toxic messages through social media. And those lines sort of need redrawing.
Rowley added that the police have looked at laws used in different countries. He said some laws are more assertive, but it is a line for politicians and Parliament to draw. During the protest outside Whitehall on Saturday, a man was also filmed shouting racial abuse. He was shouting, "Allah curses upon infidels or non-Muslims," and "Allah curses upon the Jews." The Metropolitan Police said they arrested the man on Sunday on suspicion of inciting racial hatred. Police also highlighted a sign giving full support to Hamas, asking the public to help identify who was holding it. Policing Minister Chris Philp said that so far 34 people have been arrested.
There are very clear laws in place which ban encouraging people to commit acts of terrorism. Certain organisations, including Hamas and Hezbollah, are prescribed. That means they're banned, and being a member of those organisations or glorifying them is an offence as well. There is also quite strong public order legislation.
He said there is already strong legislation that criminalises inciting racial hatred. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said there's an obligation to drive down hate crime.
We've all got a duty to take action to clamp down on hate crime, whatever political party we are in. Obviously the police are independent operationally, so these are decisions for them. But I think there have already been identified some gaps in the law in a previous review under this government. And I think the government needs to look at whether there are gaps in the law that need to be addressed as well.
A Home Office spokesperson said the Home Secretary and the government supports the police in enforcing the law, adding that they will ensure the police have everything they need to maintain law and order. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
Still to come on the show tonight. Some EU capitals saw pro-Palestinian protests over the weekend, including the first authorised by police in Paris since the Hamas terror attacks on Israel. See you after the break. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, here are some of today's headlines. The Environment Agency said Storm Babbitt has killed at least 4 people and left hundreds homeless in England. The agency said nearly 1,300 properties have been flooded, while an estimated 30,000 have needed protection against rising water levels. It said more flood warnings are expected for some of the worst affected areas this week, although severe warnings, meaning risk of death or serious injury, have been lifted. Sir Keir Starmer said the steel industry was the future, not the past, as he visited Port Talbot. The Labour leader said he had productive talks and promised to make the UK a world leader in clean green steel. Downing Street has said police are unlikely to be given more powers to address chants deemed to be extremist. After a video emerged of a pro-Palestinian protester chanting jihad, Home Secretary Suella Braverman met the Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley to urge the use of the full force of the law. It comes after officers said no offences were identified in the footage. World leaders, including Rishi Sunak, are stepping up diplomatic efforts to prevent the Israel-Gaza war triggering wider bloodshed across the Middle East. The Prime Minister, along with the leaders of the US, France, Germany, Italy and Canada, called for Israel to respect international humanitarian law. They demanded the release of the hostages held by Hamas and pushed for aid for Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu welcomed his Greek counterpart Kyriakos Mitsotakis in Jerusalem. French President Emmanuel Macron and Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte are both set to visit Israel this week. Israel's Defense Forces, or IDF, says it hit Hezbollah targets in Lebanon and 320 terror targets in Gaza overnight. It says that includes tunnels and operational command centres belonging to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. IDF aerial footage shows how the tunnels were set up near schools, a mosque and a United Nations building. Also yesterday, a second round of humanitarian aid crossed in Gaza. NTD's Jeremy Sandberg has this report.
The United Nations said Sunday its trucks transported fuel from a UN depot at Rafah border crossing inside the Gaza Strip. The UN says the fuel will be used for humanitarian aid, including for schools and hospitals. At least 14 trucks of food, water, and medicine were said to have crossed Sunday after being inspected at an Israeli checkpoint. But the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, says it's only a fraction of what they need. It called the situation very dire for the roughly 400,000 displaced people currently in its shelters.
It's really a very strict rationing. It's even counting the minimum required calories per person per day for survival.
India's Ministry of External Affairs says medical aid and disaster relief material from India arrived in Egypt Sunday and was handed over to the Egyptian Red Crescent to be distributed. UN officials say at least 100 trucks a day are needed to cover urgent necessities. Israel is stepping up targeted airstrikes against Hamas targets to minimize danger to its forces in the next stages of the war. The IDF released thermographic videos of airstrikes carried out against Hamas targets overnight. It shared images of launch sites set up across from a UN building, schools, and a mosque. The IDF aerial footage illustrates just how close the proximity is. The IDF says one soldier was killed and 3 others wounded in a brief skirmish on Sunday. It says an anti-tank missile was launched toward an IDF tank and an engineering vehicle making preparations for a ground operation into Gaza. And in the West Bank, an Israeli aerial strike was carried out in Jenin on Sunday, leaving 2 gaping holes in the roof of the Al-Ansar Mosque. Israel says a compound in a refugee camp was being used by Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists to plan attacks. An IDF spokesperson suggested a precision strike, noting the mosque is still intact, but that the terrorists were not. Jeremy Sandberg, NTD News.
Pro-Palestinian demonstrations were held in some European cities over the weekend. French police authorised the first such protest in Paris after protest organisers condemned the Hamas attacks on Israel. Meanwhile, in Berlin, police broke up an illegal rally.
Thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters gathered in front of the EU headquarters in Brussels on Sunday to condemn the EU's response. The crowd booed at the mention of EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Von der Leyen was criticised for not being fast enough to declare publicly that the bloc expected Israel to abide by international law in its response. Commission officials have said she did make that case privately, and she has since stated that position publicly too. Paris also saw a pro-Palestinian protest on Sunday. This is the first such demonstration allowed by police in the French capital since the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel. French police said the protest was authorized, unlike others, because a declaration by organizers condemned the Hamas attacks, which killed 1,400 people. In the last few days, other protests have been authorized in cities across France. It comes after the country's highest administrative court ruled that pro-Palestinian protests were to be banned on a case-by-case basis, rather than a blanket ban, as the French Interior Minister had suggested. In Berlin, an unauthorized pro-Palestinian rally was broken up by police. Some of those attending were arrested. The site was not too far from the Brandenburg Gate, where German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier was addressing a solidarity rally and urged attendees to stand against anti-Semitism.
Every single attack on Jews, on Jewish institutions, is a disgrace for Germany, and every single attack fills me with shame and anger.
Germany, along with France, is home to the EU's largest Jewish and Muslim communities. With an estimated 30,000 Palestinians, Berlin has one of the largest diaspora communities outside the Middle East.
Ukraine is facing a second winter of lengthy power outages. It comes amid relentless Russian missile and drone attacks that have left parts of the energy system more vulnerable than a year ago.
Winter is coming, and in Ukraine that is a grim prospect. The country is heading into the cold months with a crippled energy system. It's faced relentless Russian drone and missile attacks. That leaves parts of the network more vulnerable than a year ago. Dmytro Sakharuk is executive director at DTEK, the country's biggest private energy company.
Certainly, we can say that the reliability level will be lower because not everything can be done as envisaged during construction.
That will mean more long winter nights without light or heat for many Ukrainians, and yet more pain for businesses and the wider economy. Now Russia denies all charges that it's deliberately targeting energy infrastructure to inflict pain on ordinary people. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says quick help is needed from allies.
We are doing everything we can so that Ukraine acquires more air defense systems before winter. Right now, we are waiting for our partners to take certain decisions. However, all efforts regarding either the defense of critical facilities or their urgent reconstruction undertaken on a regional level have to be prioritized before winter begins.
Ukraine won't give details on the damage to its energy system, saying it's sensitive information during wartime. But in June, the United Nations estimated that the country's power generation capacity was down by around a half compared with pre-invasion levels.
Next, a river race with a Halloween twist. A small town in Belgium grows giant pumpkins and hollows them out and takes them on the water.
More than 350 people battled it out in Castelli, Belgium, by paddling in giant pumpkins as part of one of Europe's most bizarre festivals, the Pumpkin Regatta. One of last year's winners, in fancy dress, has returned to contend again.
The pumpkins are made in the morning by the organization, and then we just have to step inside, take the pedals, and just row for life.
90 teams of 4 people take part, using huge pumpkins or squash grown by the Pumpkin Society. The fun event began in 2008 and attracts between 4,000 and 5,000 people each year, made up of competitors, supporters and onlookers coming from different countries.
We are from Italy and Spain, but we work here in Belgium. We live in Brussels, yes. We got to know about this festival. We thought it was super funny, and so we just enrolled.
And it's not the only race of its kind. The president of the Pumpkin Society says there are others in the USA and in Canada.
That's all we've got time for today, but thanks for tuning in and good night.